Welcome to the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I'm your host, Nicole Davidson, and in this podcast, we'll explore the art and science of negotiation in real-world situations. Whether you're negotiating a business deal, asking for a raise, or trying to resolve a conflict with a colleague or loved one, negotiation is an essential skill that can help you achieve your goals and build better relationships. Through interviews with experts, real-life stories, and practical tips and techniques, we'll deep dive into the strategies and tactics that can make you a better negotiator. From understanding your own negotiation style, to reading body language, handling difficult conversations, and overcoming common challenges, this podcast will give you the tools you need to negotiate with confidence and achieve your objectives. So whether you're a seasoned negotiator looking to refine your skills or someone who's new to the game, join us as we explore the world of negotiation in real life. In this episode of Negotiation in Real Life, I speak with Simon Tsapepas, a Managing Director at Madison Branson Lawyers. Simon is a dynamic commercial solicitor and litigator. As a skilled and tactful negotiator, Simon is credited for his commercially sensible and intelligent approach to his clients' matters. He regularly appears in proceeds of crime and confiscation proceedings and is a member of the Confiscation and Proceeds of Crime List Users Group of the Supreme Court and the County Court of Victoria. In acting for major banks, manufacturers, individuals, SMEs, and a broad range of corporations, including ASX-listed companies, Simon has developed his practice extensively in a number of legal disciplines. These include corporate advisory, general commercial litigation, banking and finance, as well as specialised areas such as proceeds of crime and blockchain. With a strong track record advising banks, non-bank and sophisticated lenders, developers and investors, Simon regularly undertakes complex financing transactions and related projects. In our discussion today, we speak about the importance of being an effective negotiator with yourself before you can negotiate with others, the need to practice recognising what you are thinking and feeling in the moment, techniques for building strong relationships with clients, why being immediately combative may not be the right approach to get results, normalising the fact that we all have good days and bad days, negotiating in the context of a proceeds of crime dispute, considerations in negotiations involving blockchain, and much, much more. Please enjoy today's episode of Negotiation in Real Life. So I'm delighted to welcome Simon Tsapepas to our Negotiation in Real Life episode today. Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Nicole. Looking forward to it.
And I am also looking forward to our conversations. Now, I know lawyers negotiate all the time, and you've probably got lots of great stories that we're going to share, but perhaps you'd like to tell our listeners, before we get into those stories, a little bit more about your background and what it is that you do.
Absolutely. Well, I'm the Managing Director at Madison Branson Lawyers. We're a commercial law firm. Our fundamental areas involve front-end commercial, dispute work, property and family law. My niche area is proceeds of crime and confiscation, which is still commercial work. It doesn't involve acting for in the criminal sphere, and it involves acting for either an accused or a bona fide third party that has an interest in property that's been restrained by court order. And I help those clients to get back all or part of that interest in the restrained property. Another area in which we practice is banking and finance. We act for a lot of non-bank lenders, developers, particularly with the development work and assisting our lender clients with the senior, junior structuring of their financing and lending, and construction finance as well. Our last niche area is blockchain work. We act for typically startups because it is quite of a young area. And we help a lot of them acting mostly as an external GC to help them with their structuring, licensing, governance and growth to assist them to scale and exit.
Fantastic. Quite a broad range of things going on in the firm there, and fascinating area, the sort of proceeds of crime scenario. So I'm sure we'll get to some stories from that as well. Simon, we were chatting a little bit before we started recording the episode, and one of the things that stood out for me was when we were talking about your interest in negotiation, you said that one of the things you realised was that you needed to be an effective negotiator for yourself before you could effectively negotiate for others. Can you tell me a little bit more about, how did that come about, and what has it meant for you? What has it led you to do in your career?
Yeah, it's a little introspective, probably greatly introspective and philosophical. I noticed that I needed to be comfortable with myself first before I could be effective for my clients. And I think a lot of that was understanding that fundamentally we're all the same. And to a large extent in our professional capacity, or in a variety of facets of life, we put on a mask. And seeing that beyond that mask, we were, going through similar experiences, emotions, thoughts, and being able to capture myself in a variety of thought forms as when they're happening, so I can understand the motivation behind how I feel, helped me to then understand and have compassion for people in various circumstances. So that's what I meant by being an effective negotiator with myself first.
Yeah, which is so incredible. And I think what you said there about, very often we've got a mask. And I think what's suggested by what you've said is that sometimes we have a mask onto ourselves. So we actually aren't even showing our true selves to ourselves, which sounds really strange. But we almost convince ourselves that we are someone who we think we should be rather than who we are.
Absolutely. I think that we spend the earlier part of our life adding layers on, and that's not because of ourselves. It's because obviously we're brought up at a young age by our parents, and we're molded by the environment that we grow up in. And for many people, not all, at some point in their life, they start to realize that those layers don't necessarily represent themselves. And the rest of your life, I consider that we spend time taking them off and, coming down to, the real person that we are, or real being that we are, and understanding that the mind is really intrinsically void, and we feel the way that we feel based on what we add into our mind.
Really interesting. So the journey that you went through in trying to get to this place where you were understanding yourself, throwing off some of those layers, is there anything that you did that you feel would be helpful for others to think about as part of your process?
I've thought of that before. I wonder whether there's a one fits all. I don't think so. I think timing's important. What's going on in your life is important. I know for me there was a big turning point in my personal life, which I think was the catalyst for looking a bit inward. And, that was a bit of a rebirth for me. And it's gotten to me to where I am now because I was able to start looking in places that I otherwise thought was, probably nonsense for a large part. But when I saw its value and I spent more time doing it, it just became a remembering exercise and practice, And I think that the more that I did it, the more I appreciated it, the more that I could see myself in the moment. A lot of it becomes an awareness and an observance to be able to start catching yourself in the moment as opposed to looking back retrospectively and saying, oh, that's what I did. I shouldn't have done it that way.
Yeah. But it does take a lot of reflection and conscious thought, doesn't it, to sort of drive that change and make it happen over time. You can't just close your eyes and hope for the best. There's some effort that's gone into that.
Absolutely. You forget in a split second. It's like for some people getting into a car and all of a sudden, you're met with road rage that you wouldn't otherwise have in the professional context. These things are different opportunities to practice that behavior and practice remembering, okay, this is how I'm feeling. This is what I'm thinking in the moment. This is the way that I can curb that behavior by understanding when it's happening.
Yeah, I love that. And the other thing that springs to mind as you're talking about this is, you've talked about the need to sort of understand yourself, to understand the others, and that idea that we are all fundamentally the same. We're all human. But what I find really interesting, and coming back to the legal concept, is when you talk about, for example, litigation. Litigation doesn't want to know about any of that. It doesn't want to know any of the uniqueness of the person. How does that impact the way that you negotiate in a legal setting?
A couple of ways. I think that one of the other things that I noticed that helped me interact better with my clients, and not necessarily clients, stakeholders, was being a bit more real about who I was. Mm-hmm. You know, I think that as an example, when I speak to people that I've never spoken to before, if it's picking up the phone, being particularly real when you first speak to them, you know, if it involves perhaps self-deprecating humour, I think breaks down the barriers that you would otherwise have when you meet someone for the first time, and especially with clients. What I've noticed is that at the end of the day, the advice is the advice, but being able to marry that with some commercial advice, some practical advice, so that the clients can understand how that will impact them in their day-to-day, I think starts to break down the barriers of, you know, poor communication and poor negotiation and poor workings with your clients.
Yeah, which is great because, you know, poor communication is one of the biggest complaints against lawyers at the Legal Services Board. So that communication piece and focusing on that is really important. Do you think that you approach negotiations differently now to how you did at the beginning of your career, and what's changed?
I can tell you, I remember having started in commercial disputes, I guess you expect to be theatrical, you expect to be combative, and you don't realise that most of that is probably unnecessary. Mm-hmm. And I do remember what my supervising principal said to me when I had a quite terse approach with, it was just the registrar of the magistrates court, that at some point in the future, you'll probably cross paths with that person again. It's important to be mindful that you may need their help in the future, and it's important to be mindful that, you know, it won't be the last interaction that you have with them, and that being immediately combative probably isn't the right approach to get the right response from someone. And I think understanding that, hopefully quickly in my career, helped me to curb that and be far more compassionate, kind, calm.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because I think the negotiations that we get exposed to before you actually hit practice, whether you're a lawyer or whether you're in business, the negotiations that we see are often those very dramatised Hollywood things. I mean, I grew up in the age of LA law. I don't know what the legal drama of your time was, but they're always, you know, high dynamics, big tempers, massive negotiations, as opposed to a nice, calm, collaborative conversation, which is pretty boring for TV drama.
Absolutely. And a lot of that is relevant to our workplace too. It is a tense and stressful environment, particularly in a dispute practice. You have a lot of deadlines. You have clients spending a considerable amount of money. There are a lot of concerns, and it's not just the stresses that we get from working with our clients. It's also stresses that we have at home and our personal life. And, you know, it's human nature to bring that with us to work and bring our work home to our personal lives. And broadcasting that in our workplace and canvassing that we understand that we're all human beings and we all have different days, and some days it's good for me, some days it's not good for me, I think helps us to appreciate that, again, you know, a lot of it is putting on a mask and we're really just the human entity behind all of it, so that we can be a little bit more considerate that, you know, John Smith is going to have a bad day one day and we just have to, you know, get around him to make him feel a bit better, because the next day he's going to come good. You know, life is peaks and troughs, and it's just about being comfortable, being uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah, very, very good advice. So in terms of some of your experiences, are there any negotiations that really stand out for you that have been defining moments in changing the way you negotiate or learning how to do it better?
I think that, you know, the first point, being overly combative, isn't helpful. I've noticed that with proceeds of crime and confiscation work, it's a draconian regime, particularly the Commonwealth regime. It's difficult for clients to understand that. The pressure is immediately put back on them to be able to satisfy the court or even the petitioning authority that applied for the restraining order, that all of their interest in the property that's restrained has come from lawful sources or being maintained lawfully. And the challenging thing for them to understand that if there has been an allegation of offending, that they really need to prove that in the absence of proper records, how they derived that property was lawful. And sometimes for them, it's difficult to comprehend that if you don't have good books and records, it's going to be difficult to convince the court otherwise, notwithstanding that there may have been no association between the acquisition of the property and the offending. And that's particularly challenging to explain to someone effectively, it is what it is. And they're the parameters in which we have to move. So notice that by comparison to general commercial disputes, we're spending a lot of time coaching clients through that and understanding what it might look like at the end of the dispute in the process, because they can run for a long time, and particularly in circumstances where they're deferred, they're held in abeyance pending the determination of a criminal proceeding.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, what I'm seeing there is that one of the biggest interests that the client has is actually a sense of fairness, because presumably they're so focused on the fact that this seems unfair to them that it's hard for them to get into the right space of actually going, how do we manage this? What makes sense to do?
Definitely, absolutely.
Are there any tips or are there any techniques that you've developed for yourself to help get them through that kind of, really it's a psychological barrier, isn't it?
It is. I think comparisons, explaining other scenarios, demonstrating the factual scenarios in relation to earlier cases that have been resolved unfavourably, creates that consistency and understanding that, okay, I'm in the same boat with others. I'm not the first person to be aggrieved because of the draconian regime. I'm going to have to accept the circumstances and start to, be guided by my solicitor.
Well, that's really interesting, because I think that addresses not only their interest or their concern around fairness, but it also starts getting them thinking about, in negotiation terms, their BATNA or their best alternative, and realising that any outcome that's better than that really bad outcome, that what might be realistic in court might be something that they should be thinking about, and helping them sort of come to terms with that, I guess. Do you ever feel stuck in a negotiational conflict? You're not quite sure what the next step should be? Friends and colleagues may give advice, but perhaps they're only seeing things from your side. My new negotiation GP service is for exactly that situation. You can book a short, standard or long consultation where we will explore your situation using a systematic approach. You will walk away with concrete steps to follow and an increased confidence to manage the situation. To learn more, head to my website at nicoledavidsonnegotiation.com.au, where you can book a consultation online. Don't forget, I also offer one-on-one coaching, team training and expert advice on specific negotiations. My tailored approach is designed to meet your specific needs, and my proven methodologies and strategies are grounded in the latest research and best practices. So whether you're a small business owner, a corporate executive or anyone in between, let me help you achieve your negotiation goals and maximise your success. How much negotiation is there in a proceeds of crime dispute?
Depends on who your opponent is, I think. And it also depends on the circumstances of the particular proceeding. The work that we do is separated by state work and Commonwealth work. So the authority for the Commonwealth regime is the AFP, and for state we're dealing with the OPP for the DPP. We find that the negotiations are easier in the state-based regime. Don't know why, it's just a matter of history. Negotiations can happen very early. They don't have to wait until our client's affidavit evidence is filed. And that really comes down to the strength of the evidence that we see from the outset. Recently resolved a matter for a client who hasn't had his criminal charges determined yet or withdrawn. But we were confident with the evidence in respect of the proceeds of crime, the confiscation proceeding, that we gave the advice that he should run it whilst the criminal proceeding was on foot. And because of the strength of the evidence, we were able to present that to the OPP early, and we were able to enter negotiations quite quickly.
Yeah, fabulous. So when you're negotiating in different circumstances, so if you're doing more front-end negotiation, do you change the way you approach those conversations?
Yes. I think there's more to compromise with the front-end negotiations. And there are a variety of practical considerations that will only be realised by the outcome of the negotiations. And I think it's bringing that forward and understanding where is it that we're trying to get to will help us determine how we compromise or how we approach the negotiation in respective points that we want to maintain. So I think that there's a wider berth when it comes to what we can and can't do for front negotiation.
And so being very clear on the goals is important, but there's also more scope for actually creating value rather than, I guess, proceeds of crime is a great example of a splitting the pie negotiation. There's a fixed pool of resource that's being argued about. There's no win-win going to come out of that negotiation.
That's
Clearly
right.
The front end has more scope for that.
Yes.
So you mentioned earlier, Simon, that one of the areas that you do work in is with blockchain. Now, I have to say blockchain largely goes over my head. I've looked at a couple of articles and I'm sure one day I'll get a mediation involving blockchain. But I'm assuming that with a new technology, there might be some special considerations or things that people need to take into account when their contract and therefore their contract negotiations have a blockchain component in them. Am I right?
Definitely. And it depends on where the advice is being given. In other words, at what jurisdiction it relates to. One of the setbacks, I think, for lawyers is that in Australia, we don't really have the regulatory landscape isn't properly defined. A lot of the key stakeholders and leaders in the space are contributing to petition the government, help the government understand what is blockchain and all of the other practical concepts that have evolved from that. And how can we introduce a set of laws that would help govern clients, lawyers, etc., key stakeholders in this jurisdiction. The difficulty for us is giving advice in respect of the current framework, knowing that in 1 year, 2 year, 3 years' time, that advice may be irrelevant.
It's a real challenge, isn't it? And I guess, the negotiation strategist in me immediately jumps to having contingencies. If there's, arguments that it should go in direction A or direction B, I might want to have in my contract contingencies that address each of those possibilities. But I guess you can't list out all of the various possibilities because there's so much we don't know where it's going to go.
Absolutely. But I think that to give people comfort that don't properly understand it and have an interest in understanding it, it can be overwhelming to understand the use forms, what it does, how it does it. But in respect of its intersect with the law, we're drawing on, fundamentals in law to shape the laws that will apply specifically to this industry. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We're using what we've already got. Which
for many people is still a bit opaque and not very understandable if you're not a lawyer.
Probably.
Fantastic. Well, I've had a really great chat talking with you about some of these issues, and I still will one day get my head around blockchain. For people who might have a need to get in touch with you or interested in learning more about blockchain or proceeds of crime or just generally talking to you, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you, Simon?
Email, it's s@madisonbranson.com.
That is one of the shortest emails I've ever come across, just S.
My last name doesn't help, so that was the motivation behind it.
Fair enough. So email, or I think you're about to say website, was it?
Yeah, website. It's just madisonbranson.com.
Fantastic. And I'll put those details along with LinkedIn or other social media handles onto the show notes as well. So, Simon, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the Negotiation in Real Life podcast today. Thanks so much for your time.
Likewise. Thank you very much, Nicole.
That's all for this episode of the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and learned something new that you can apply in your own negotiations. Remember, negotiation is a skill that can be developed and refined over time, so keep practicing and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us on social media or email us directly. And if you liked this episode, please leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It helps us to reach more people and continue to produce high-quality content. Until next time, keep negotiating in real life.